welcome to our climate science teach-in for climate activists. Bienvenue tout le monde. Je vais commencer avec un land acknowledgement. This is being put out by a lab at Concordia, and Concordia is on unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk Nation. And right now I'm in Knowlton, which is on Wabanaki territory. So I just wanted to start by saying that. Okay, so we are now going to introduce the lab. This is Damon Matthews. Damon, you want to wave? He leads this climate lab at Concordia in the Geography and Planning and Environment Department. And I'm going to hand it over to him to introduce the lab, and then we'll go into questions.
Well, thanks everyone for coming today. This is a fun experiment, and hopefully will be a interesting experience for everybody. So, I've been a professor at Concordia University for coming up on 13 years now, and we've had a nice group of grad students that have come and gone over that period of time. So we're currently a group of I guess there are 9 of us here today who have made themselves available to answer questions. PhD students, master's students, a couple of postdoctoral researchers. Our research in the group is pretty interdisciplinary. Most of us come from a science background, although not all. Some also bring social science expertise. We're all interested in contributing to the knowledge base around climate science, and also investigating potential solutions to the climate challenge. And so we'll do our best to answer whatever questions come at us. Thanks very much to Jen for organizing this, and yeah, let's get started.
Great. Can I have all the lab members wave? Donnie, Sam, Mitch, Daniel, Etienne, Seth. Great. So everyone's got different expertise. So as you throw questions at us, we'll see who can answer them. All right. Does anyone have a question to get us going? Again, you can raise your virtual hand or your human hand if you have your video on, or indicate in the chat that you have a question. Who wants to be the first? Okay, come on, folks, don't be shy. Now, we did start on the Facebook page some questions, so we can start with those if people are feeling shy to get us going. Does that sound good? So, one of the questions was, and maybe this one could be for Damon. Damon, what is up with the 1.5 degree limit? What does it mean? What have we passed it? Why 1.5?
So there's a whole 300-page report written to answer that question. Came out a couple of years ago. So I'll give you a few sentence summary. So we talk about global temperature increase relative to pre-industrial, which is about 150 years ago, and over that period of time, so to date, global temperatures have increased by 1.1 degrees, which is a little bit more than 1 degree, and are increasing at about 0.2 degrees per decade. So we're kind of on track at the rate things are going right now to reach 1.5 degrees in something like 15 years, give or take some number of years, because all of these numbers are somewhat uncertain. But so let's say in round numbers, we're something like 15 years away from 1.5 degrees at the rate we're going right now. Of course, the timeline for when we reach 1.5 degrees has a lot to do with what emissions do over the next over the next decade, in particular carbon dioxide emissions, which are of course the primary driver of temperature increases. The last few years have seen a plateauing of global carbon dioxide emissions. They're not increasing as fast as they had previously, and the most recent, 2019 in particular, didn't increase at all above 2018 levels. Of course, 2020 is going to be an interesting year because of the lockdown and the effect of that on global emissions. So yeah, 1.5 degrees, it means a lot of different things. It's thought to be the level at which climate changes start to become substantially more dangerous than they already are. There's the Paris Climate Agreement has targeted limiting warming to well below 2 degrees and to kind of do our best to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And the reason for that is that there are evidence of particular climate impacts involving things like coral reefs, extreme weather events, wildfires that are thought to get much worse after we start moving beyond 1.5 degrees.
Okay, any questions? Anyone ready with a question? Okay, we've got a question from Guy or Guy in the chat. His question is, so what about the global carbon budget? What does that mean? And by when do we actually have to have emissions to avoid exceeding 1.5? Which lab member would like to take on that one?
Maybe I'll take that one as well, just because it follows quite closely to what I was just saying.
Thanks, Guy.
So the global carbon budget is what we call the total amount of carbon dioxide that we are allowed to emit in order to limit warming to a particular level. So the idea of the carbon budget is that at some point we actually need to stop emitting carbon dioxide entirely in order to stop temperatures from continuing to increase. So the question was, by when do we actually have to have emissions to avoid exceeding 1.5? So ultimately we need to bring emissions down to 0, and that's the only emissions target that will really stabilize global temperatures. And again, in very round numbers, but if we were to globally have emissions within the next 10 years and then bring them down to 0 by 2040, that would be a scenario that would leave a good chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. If we take longer to get to net zero emissions, then the likelihood of staying below 1.5 degrees doesn't decrease to 0, but it drops off dramatically the longer it takes.
Great. Anyone else have a question to throw at this lab of climate scientists?
Question from Nicholas.
Yep. Okay. Yeah. Nicholas, go ahead. Nicholas Chevalier.
Hi, everyone. So going on the past questions, which are more broad in range, there's been talk about an Arctic blue ocean event being a possibility this year. And also, do you think because of this pandemic, the effects of global dimming are warranted as an effect on temperature? So sorry, 2 questions there.
Who wants to take that one?
I always ask the easy ones.
Yeah, no, that's not an easy question, actually. So Arctic, so by blue ocean event, I assume you mean, actually, maybe you could clarify what you mean by blue ocean event before I answer.
As in within the seasonal melting of the ice, we get to the point where there's actually no ice within the Arctic Circle.
Okay. Okay. So I haven't actually heard that discussed as a possibility this year. I know that sea ice extents are currently nearing their minimum recorded extent. If I have my numbers right, I believe the lowest extent of sea ice in the Arctic was in 2012. And so we are kind of approaching that level of a record low sea ice extent. Typically, it's around the end of September that the minimum sea ice extent is reached and then starts to regrow in a given season. So I don't think an ice-free Arctic is in any of the predictions for this year. But it's certainly something that is expected to happen at some point as temperatures continue to increase, and that at some point could be as little as 20 years. It could be 30 or 40, depending on how the dynamics of the Arctic play out. The second question about global dimming. And so this is global dimming refers to the observation that human industry produces a huge amount of particulate matter in addition to greenhouse gases, and many of those particulates in the atmosphere are reflective and tend to yeah, I mean, on their own they would cool the planet. When combined with greenhouse gas emissions, they decrease the amount of warming that we otherwise would have seen, and so it's a very substantial effect. And you know, one of the real challenges in climate mitigation is figuring out how to reduce particulate emissions, which obviously have you know, problematic implications for air quality and health, in addition to their climate effect. So how do we reduce those emissions without exacerbating climate warming? And I mean, it's going to be something. There's a lot of studies going on right now, because one of the predominant effects of the COVID lockdown has been to reduce air pollution in many parts of the world. And so there is likely a climate signature of that. And I imagine, I mean, I haven't heard any research that's come out yet on that topic, but I imagine it will in the near future.
Thanks, Damon. Thanks, Nicholas, for the great question. Challenging question. So now we have a question from Nafija in the chat. Coming from a non-environment background, she asks, what can regular folks be focusing on in order to reduce our environmental impact? She acknowledges it's a very general question, but a very important question. Perhaps Seth and I can try to take that one. Our work both relates to that. Seth, do you want to go for it? What can regular folks do to reduce environmental impact?
Yeah, sure. So if you're thinking about your own carbon footprint, your own lifestyle emissions, I would say the big ones for people living in rich Western nations especially are to live car-free, so just avoid personal vehicle use or cut that back, switch to an electric vehicle, whatever works in that category. Reduce meat consumption, especially beef consumption. That would be kind of the highest impact food that most people tend to eat and eat a lot of. And then avoiding air travel. And we saw a lot of people sort of forced to do that during the pandemic, but as that becomes more of a choice, it's something that we can give more consideration to. And then the flip side of that is those are ways to reduce your own footprint, but you can be thinking about ways to actively engage. And you know, as a group of activists, I'm sure that there's a lot of wisdom just in the participants of this group, but voting for climate leaders, contacting elected officials and asking them to be more ambitious in their climate proposals, protesting once we can get back to doing those sorts of things in person, those would be big too. Jen, did I miss anything? What are your thoughts?
No, I'll just add to that. So I think that one thing people can do, again, beyond the making changes to their own lifestyle, is to join movements, and join movements that are specifically targeting systemic change, that are really trying to change the economic system away from an economic system that's based on endless growth, to join movements that are really prioritizing and raising up the voices of those most impacted by climate change and environmental destruction. And by really lending support to the people on the front lines, especially the Indigenous folks that are actively stopping pipelines by defending their lands and waters, that are actively stopping mines, and that are really offering radically different ways of living, radically different worldview and solutions to climate change. So I think in my research, I have really come to think that supporting frontlines Indigenous communities is one of the highest leverage sort of things average people can do. And I think there's often a big debate about what's more effective, individual choice, individual lifestyle change, or like policy change, or blah, blah, blah. And I think all that has to happen. So there's no lack of opportunities to work on all that. So yeah, no wrong way. We need it all. That's what I think. All right, we have.
I would add something to
Sure.
to complement Seth and Jen's answers. So my research focuses on alternative economic systems to address climate change and all the other problems we have. I'm specifically interested in degrowth economics, and I think that as as an individual wanting to like work on systemic change, we should also strive for movements or actions that bring us towards a relocalization of the economy, because there's no indication that we can keep importing stuff from the mangoes from Chile in the middle of the winter without emitting carbon. So I think a very important thing is to be aware that the fact that your food comes from the other end of the world, or anything else that you can produce locally isn't produced locally. Well, be aware of that and strive to achieve more local consumption and achieve to create movements that create more local production. So that would be my my 2 cents on that question.
Thank you, Etienne. I just would like to reiterate that we invite you to poser des questions en français aussi. Il y a des gens dans le lab qui peuvent répondre en français. Donc, s'il vous plaît, posez des questions en français si tu veux. We have another question in the chat from Rob. He says, at what point would facing the risks associated with geoengineering a cooler planet become preferable to the harms of global warming's likely trajectory? That's a scary and good, very important question. Who wants to take that one on?
I could try, and then maybe Damon could fill in the gaps if I have any. One of the problems with geoengineering is, or like a common, the most common idea thought of for geoengineering is emitting particulate matter that will block solar radiation, reduce the amount that is reaching the Earth's surface to cool the planet. Now, some of the problems with this are that the climate system is very, very complex. So depending on how we do this or where we're releasing that particulate matter, it's going to affect the climate system in other ways. So for instance, like local weather could change, and these impacts probably won't be distributed equally. So geoengineering, maybe it might reduce global temperatures and help everyone in terms of global warming, but there's going to be side effects of it, and how those will be distributed probably won't be equal. So it becomes kind of a political issue. There isn't much precedent of humans being able to fully kind of monitor these systems. So one example that has been brought up is when you have island states and they try and manage different biological factors, so invasive species and things, by introducing other species to get rid of them. There's often side effects because we can't understand these systems fully. Now, the climate system is the much bigger example of that. And so it's quite dangerous to consider geoengineering. So because of all the uncertainty around it, it's, in my opinion, something that we should really avoid at all costs, because we really don't know what type of risks. So to say that they may be preferable to the harms of global warming is difficult. Is there anything you want to add, Damon?
I think that's a good answer. One thing I would add, I guess, is that the word geoengineering refers to actually a lot of different things, and recently people have tried to distinguish between geoengineering strategies that involve reflecting solar radiation and calling those solar radiation management, versus geoengineering ideas that involve trying to extract carbon from the atmosphere, and that those are kind of two different things. Both are kind of intentional interventions in the system, and so that's why they fit in the same category, but they are quite different, and they have very different implications associated with them. I think in general, my take on this is that whenever we intervene in a complex system, we're going to create undesirable impacts, and climate change is it is the epitome of an undesirable impact because of industrial activity, and if we yeah, I think the more we try to kind of manage the system, given how complex it is, the more undesirable impacts we will create. So I don't think I don't think it's actually very likely that we can avoid impacts by intervening more in the system. I think it's more likely that we will exacerbate net impacts by introducing additional strategies like geoengineering.
And actually, one other thing I'd like to add is that if we say we are successful at geoengineering the planet to reduce global warming, one of the side effects of that is that it may de-incentivize reducing carbon dioxide emissions. So it becomes a kind of lock-in where we have to continue geoengineering the planet, and perhaps more so than we otherwise would. So it doesn't really incentivize reducing these greenhouse gases that stay and warm the climate system for centuries. So it's quite a short-term approach, in my opinion.
And to echo Mitch's comment there, I think there's also something to be said about, how humans are approaching these large, complex issues such as climate change, and geoengineering as one of those potential solutions doesn't actually address the fundamental issue, which is over emitting. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Mitch, David, and Maida, and thanks for the good question. So Tanya asked a question in the chat. Any idea of the differences in emissions between importing food versus growing food in greenhouses locally? Seth, go ahead.
I would say that it's a tough question to answer. So normally what you'd want to do is something called the life cycle assessment, where you look at emissions of that food along all of the different stages of production and transportation and so on. And when you do those assessments for different foods, you might get different answers. So a tomato that's grown in Canada, let's say in a hothouse, like a greenhouse in Alberta, and it's heated with natural gas or even with, I don't know, electricity coming from coal power, that could have a huge carbon footprint. And something that is shipped overseas can be fairly efficient. And so boats can move a huge volume, a huge mass of stuff very efficiently. And so that could actually not be that big of a deal. So it depends on how they're moved, because the flip side of that is if you have an exotic fish that's flown in the next day, then that's going to have a huge carbon footprint, and it's going to be way worse than something that's grown locally. And we can also think about which of those systems is desirable for the future, because one of them might be easier to decarbonize. So it might be really easy to heat that greenhouse 10 years from now using renewable energy, but we might still be burning fossil fuels to move things a long distance, especially if you need to move them quickly. So it's a tricky one. I would say more of your effort in terms of food should go into what you eat rather than where it comes from. Just meat tends to be the bigger concern when you're looking at your carbon footprint. And other than that, you kind of have to do a little bitty research because it can get really tricky.
Great. So Rochelle has a question. Rochelle, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Hey, hi. I also have a question about carbon capture, but more in ecosystems, so in biological ecosystems. Yeah, I mean, what I've read, about this is that, of course, it sort of seems that sort of preserving existing ecosystems is really key, and generally they're very efficient at capturing carbon, but a lot of kind of contradictory stuff about regenerating ecosystems. And whether or not, what type of ecosystem and how to do it most effectively. And given the fact that ecosystems that have been degraded take a long time to grow, what produces the quickest, but also the most sustainable results. And if anybody, if there's no one in the group specifically has sort of this expertise, I would be really interested in, more resources to try to understand this.
I can speak to that in general terms, and if you have a kind of specific thing, please let me know, and I can try to address it in more detail. I mean, so I mean, okay, it depends on the ecosystem, but I think a general rule is that any disturbance to an ecosystem will decrease the amount of carbon that's stored in that ecosystem.
Yep.
You know, it could be a wildfire, it could be an insect outbreak, and it could be a human or an anthropogenic disturbance. You know, certainly logging, you know, as soon as you remove the trees from the forest, the carbon that is in those trees eventually will go to the atmosphere. And depending on the system, also the carbon that is stored in the soil will decompose more rapidly in the absence of tree cover. So, so you know, we think of wood as a kind of a climate-friendly, you know, building material, potentially fuel, and you know, so it is more climate-friendly than fossil fuels, coal, natural gas, you know, because we're, you know, rather than introducing new carbon to the system that's been kind of geologically inert for millennia, we're in the case of forest-based or forest management, where, you know, we're cycling carbon into the system that has a much shorter lifespan. Right? So, you know, it is, you know, more possible to imagine that carbon going back into the ecosystem on shorter timescales. But, you know, the timescales we're looking at right now in terms of trying to avoid dangerous climate impacts are like, you know, a couple of decades or, you know, a few years. And so even those timescales are far too short to allow carbon to be returned to forests that we are cutting down. And so, you know, right now, deforestation is a net source of carbon to the atmosphere. Land use in general is a net source of carbon, but, you know, we're losing carbon from ecosystems because of the disturbances that we're introducing to them, and more forest management will mean more carbon emissions, and so it is a bit of a myth that that by definition wood is a climate-friendly building material. You know, that said, you know, if you know, if we have existing you know, forest management areas and those forests are managed effectively, then, you know, you can have a stable carbon stock, and that can be a renewable resource. You know, certainly if we are expanding forest management into areas that haven't previously been managed or disturbed, that will, you know, inevitably be a net source of carbon and a loss of carbon from the ecosystem.
Yeah. Can I ask a follow-up question? And again, if it's referring to other resources, that'd be great, because I really struggled. I'm talking about managed forests, not managed in the sense that necessarily there's wood being taken off the property, but these are regenerated sites, right? Sites that have been disturbed already. And maybe also sites where I mean, where you're not talking meadows, right? Or farmland that's sort of been allowed to sort of regenerate naturally. So I'm just asking, you know, just really struggling with guidance around, you know, is tree planting, which does disturb this, it disturbs the soil, right? Is that necessarily, because I've seen some studies that suggest actually, you know, leaving a meadow the way it is actually comparatively it captures more carbon than a replanted area. Or sort of similarly, like, you know, like leaving fallen wood versus removing it and using it for construction, right? So I guess I'm talking about just sort of looking for general guidance on how we kind of regenerate, you know, farmland, you know, like, you know, urban centers. I mean, is it really, you know, intensively planting native species? I mean, you know, just some of this, because just the how it's done, because I've struggled to find that guidance.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think it does depend a lot on the ecosystem that you're working in. I mean, it is true that grassland soils can store a lot of carbon, just by the nature of the plants and how they grow. You know, if a forest can grow in a particular area, you know, the carbon in the trees is obviously a lot more than what you would find in grasses, but, you know, the soil may or may not have more carbon. I mean, I don't think I haven't heard that planting trees is ever a negative
okay, yeah, there was a study,
carbon balance, but I may not have. I mean, you know, I might have missed something in this area as well.
No, again, part of it is pointed, there's a debate now between sort of allowing ecosystems to regenerate themselves versus human interference in it, with, you know, with techniques that do just and all of the carbon that's stored in that.
No, and I think it's true that disturbances in general will help them less, at least on short time scales. And, so it's an interesting question, and certainly afforestation is being billed as a really important climate solution. Afforestation being the introduction of forests in places where there previously weren't forests. And I know it's a good question as to whether or not that actually is a net represents a net uptake of carbon or not.
Thanks, Rochelle, for those questions, and Damon for responding. We have Trevor with Trevor's hand up. Go ahead, Trevor. Unmute yourself and throw one at us.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the climate lab itself. Obviously, you focus on climate issues, but I was wondering, is there sort of like a guiding principle or consensus on what types of projects you focus on? Does every student kind of bring their own project, or kind of a top-down thing? I was just curious, like how you choose, and I guess how much is this affected by what's current in kind of climate change? Like could a project change on a dime, or just a bit of the insider info?
Yes, that one's for you, Damon.
I guess so. I mean, in any academic lab, there's always going to be kind of overarching projects that kind of as a researcher that I've initiated or am involved with. And to the extent that those projects come with funding, they can create graduate student projects that can be funded from a particular grant. So some people over the years have like come in and they've taken up a project that is associated with a larger grant. Others in our group have come with their own ideas, maybe their own funding as well from a scholarship. And in that case, people can be much more self-directed in the questions they ask and they're interested in. And I sort of do my best as a supervisor to help them along in the research that they want to do. So I'd say we're a mix of people who kind of get interested in and take on something, say, related to climate modeling, and which is kind of my core expertise. And there are others that kind of bring their own interests and expertise and kind of define and run with their own projects.
I'm not seeing any more hands or any questions in the chat. Does anyone have any? If not, I can go to some of the questions from the Facebook page. Oh, one just came up from Dante. Okay, Dante, do you want to just say it, or should I read it out? So consider.
Actually, you could read it out, or I could,
okay.
Whatever.
Lorsque je me rends au marché métro, je trouve les légumes réguliers et bio qui se ressemblent complètement. Dans ce contexte, est-ce que la culture bio est devenue aussi efficace que la production commerciale? So, does anyone want to translate the question so that we could see who wants to answer it?
So it's a question of whether sort of organic agriculture is equally efficient as conventional agriculture, and presumably also to what extent is organic agriculture more climate friendly than conventional agriculture? I mean, I can take a stab at it unless anyone else wants to try.
I could mention really briefly that I've seen a couple of meta-analyses on these topics. So those are studies that incorporate a whole bunch of other studies in order to get the best sort of data. And they've found, I guess, that the answer is complicated. And so depending on how you look at the question, they might find that organic systems maybe increase biodiversity or seem to be better for carbon, but they also require more land in order to produce the same amount of food. And if you account for all of that extra land that's needed, then suddenly you can think to yourself, oh, if we use that extra land and just grew a forest on it instead of growing food on it, we could have saved so much more carbon. And so My inclination is that it's not a great climate solution as of now. We've also been doing organic agriculture for less time, so we might be able to improve those systems and they might get better. Organic does have benefits. There seems to be a strong agreement that it's better for instance, workers, especially in developing nations, because they're less exposed to toxic pesticides. So there are good reasons to do it from what I've seen. Climate isn't like a huge, clear consensus as to why. I'm not sure if that agrees with what you've seen, Damon.
Est-ce que quelqu'un peut traduire la réponse un peu avant qu'on aille à Damon pour une autre réponse?
Merci, Jen.
Yeah, Etienne?
Oui, ouais, j'ai pas super bien écouté toute la réponse, mais en gros, la réponse, c'est que c'est une question compliquée, puis que dépendamment de comment est-ce que comment est-ce que tu regardes la culture bio versus conventionnelle, l'agriculture, tu peux avoir des réponses différentes. Actually, je me rappelle même pas c'était quoi la réponse.
Je peux essayer de
OK, yeah.
Mais il y a beaucoup de raisons pour faire des produits bio, des raisons de santé, de réduire les pesticides, d'améliorer la biodiversité, mais c'est pas clair qu'il y a vraiment un bénéfice pour le climat. Je pense que c'est en gros c'est la réponse là. I mean, there's lots of things that are, environmental sustainability issues are often linked, and there are often things that contribute to multiple environmental goals, and there's many good reasons to do lots of different things, and some of them have a climate link and others don't. So I think for organic agriculture, the jury is out as to whether or not it really makes much difference from a purely climate perspective, even if there are many other good reasons to support organic agriculture.
Does anyone else, even like participants, audience members, want to argue why organic is a good climate solution? Or okay, Dante, are you satisfied?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I asked a question in French. I could have asked it in English. I don't know if that's...
Non, c'est bon. On va être bilingue ici.
I was just curious to know if we go to the market, we buy organic food thinking it's good for the environment, it's good for us, but at the same time, it's like I'm questioning if it's how real is that? It's like is the organic food can we trust the producers? Can we trust that in 10 years from now we're not going to learn that it's like there's some problem that we didn't know, that or some bullshit that's happened, and anyways it's more on that angle I was thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that it is better for you and better for the environment in general.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the evidence is pretty clear for that. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just a question of whether it has an effect on climate, or like on carbon fluxes in an agricultural system. It's less clear.
I think there might be an additional advantage in terms of people that do get invested to understand the differences between regular agriculture and organic agriculture. They'll be maybe a little more informed with the food systems and understand how to kind of maybe understand the food system a little bit better, so that they can reduce their carbon footprint with their food choices as well. So it's not necessarily just about whether this produce is equivalent to this produce, but it's more about how am I spending my money in terms of the type of agriculture that I support, but also what type of food systems do I want to maintain. And I think that would be kind of an interesting way to kind of think about it as well. And yes, there are some big monocultures that kind of maybe whitewash some of the, or greenwash some of their produce to make it organic. But I think if you're really invested, you'll be able to kind of suss those out.
Great. Okay, great. So I just wanted to share that there's an exciting thing happening on the discussion, which is we had a question from, who was that from? Sorry, from Rob, was it Rob? Yes, it was Rob asking what people's favorite books related to climate, ecology, conservation to recommend. So I encourage all lab people as well as all the audience members to share in the chat your favorite books that you think are really powerful and really great. We also have a question from Guy on the topic of degrowth, decolonization, and local economies. How can we encourage a lower emphasis on economic growth and resource extraction and instead of a higher emphasis on low carbon jobs like education and care work? Oh, that seems like it would have been a great one for Dan, who had to leave. Although Dan had told me that if we need him back, someone could text him and tell him to hop back on, and he will. But in the meantime, so maybe can someone text him? And at the same time, can someone also try to answer that question? It's a good one.
So I can put my 2 cents on that question. It's a really tough question because you're asking like how do individuals or groups of individuals that want a big systemic change can influence the state, because I think that the question of degrowth, decolonization, local economies requires a restructuration of the economy that requires big changes in the state, in institutions. I was reading yesterday a proposal for a local currency, but it's not exactly a local currency. It's a complementary currency that would complement the current globally exchangeable currency that we have. And this complementary currency would be issued by each nation to everyone as a basic income, and it would only be usable on locally produced things, which would reduce the incentive for people to work jobs just to survive, jobs that often are bad for the environment. And it would reduce the incentive then for economic growth, because while you don't need to squeeze all your time and effort into a job that gives profit to your employer or whoever at the end of the economic chain of that job, because you have all your basic needs met by your like local basic income. So I'm going to link that article that I was reading. It's very kind of like jargony and sciencey, and I haven't seen any more palatable proposal about it. But if you're interested, I'm going to link that in the chat.
Great. And we've got Daniel back, who I think would have stuff to say on this question. Dan, do you see the question, or shall I repeat it again? Guy's question in the chat.
I don't see the question.
Okay, the question is on the topic of degrowth, decolonization, local economies. How can we encourage less emphasis on economic growth and resource extraction, instead of higher emphasis on low carbon jobs like education and care work? So Etienne just gave his answer. Do you have an answer to that? Or you could also ask Guy for more clarity. Up to you.
How do you discourage this? Yeah, I'm not sure. Is that referring to like a public intervention, a policy intervention, a social movement intervention?
I think all of the above.
All of the above.
Choose your favorite.
Yeah, just to clarify, I guess it really is like a systems change question. But I mean, what are some, I guess, suitable, like doable pathways maybe?
Well, I guess to move away from, if what you're getting at, moving away from an extraction-oriented, extraction-based economy towards something that's more ecological and more just, would require, finding ways to build an economy that's not, that doesn't derive its basis of wealth from exploitation of nature and exploitation of other people. So yeah, it's an open question, because it's very hard to tell what will happen because we've never actually had an industrial scale economy that wasn't based on profligate energy consumption and exploitation of cheap labor. So it's the question of whether it's even possible is an open one, but to start, you would have to probably have to cut back on economic scale and consumption, and transition people out of primarily in terms of climate fossil fuel extraction and into other sectors. Care, of course, is a big one. It could also be environmental remediation and other kinds of things that the specifics are, there are endless possibilities. It's just a matter of we have to fully change how we live and where we get our food and energy from, decentralize energy systems, de-urbanize cities a bit. So you can imagine a world that looks pretty fundamentally different from the one we currently live in. Devolve power, decision-making power, so then you have people's time won't be taken up by work in the way that it is today. There's going to be a lot more civic participation in this kind of world. So people may work a few hours a day. Some of that time will be spent doing agriculture or working on pieces of infrastructure that they need. Let's say on decentralized energy, if we're living in pretty decentralized ways, people will be very much less specialized, and maybe there'll be part of their day that'll be spent on specialized labor, but there's going to be time where they're going to do things that provide directly for their basic needs and subsistence, caring for their communities, and also participating in decision making at their level and then at higher levels as well, which is a whole other conversation. But I mean, you can see how an individual's life changes, and the whole way the economy changes. And I mean, it's I don't know if that starts to answer your question or not, but
I'd just like to add, thanks for that, Dan. I'd just like to add that I have been noticing over the last couple of years, more and more sort of deep systemic change being called for in more mainstream climate activism and policy work, like things like the Green New Deal and sort of platforms for a just recovery from COVID have been asking for some pretty, profound transformative demands. So I think we are seeing a sort of a more mainstreaming of transformative change and things around justice or status for all, and land back for Indigenous folks, and other things that are becoming more mainstream that do speak to this like transformative deep change in our systems and going to a completely different way of running our economies and our governance systems. So I think there is a move towards that, and then supporting the movements that are asking for deep change, that are rallying around sort of more radical asks. I think that's happening, and so I think we can help promote that by supporting those movements. Thanks for that question. It was a great one. So great book ideas coming through the chat, and now we're just going to do a couple more questions, and we have about 8 minutes left. So we're gonna, if you have burning questions, get them into the chat or put your hand up. We're going to go to a couple of more questions. Okay, one of the questions is, does anyone have a response to the throne speech from yesterday vis-a-vis climate change, I imagine? Anyone follow that and have any responses to how its implications for climate change?
I have to confess that it was my birthday yesterday, so I didn't actually listen to the throne speech. But ask me tomorrow, maybe I'll have some better answers.
Did anyone watch it?
I put a formal response from a senator in the chat thread here. People can see that.
Okay.
I haven't watched it yet, but this seems to be a good response.
Okay, so check that out. We have another question from Nicolas Chevalier. Do folks see the risks of their work leading to the financialization of nature?
I can't say I've ever seen that as a risk of the type of research that I've been involved with. I mean, I think it is there are, general risks of that happening in any kind of societal response to climate change. I think there's also risks of, increased pressure on ecosystems because of some types of climate policies as well. And even, the ban, ban on plastic bags is an example of how, if all of the plastic bags in the world were, switched to paper without a reduction in the amount of bags that are being consumed, that would actually put enormous additional pressure on forest products and have negative environmental consequences. And so, I think it's something to just keep in mind when thinking about climate solutions, is that we do need to find solutions that will, steer the human Earth system, as a whole towards a more sustainable end, and not trade off some environmental impacts for others.
Okay.
I can maybe speak to some of the urban side of things in terms of that question. There always is this kind of, within an urban society, when they start to kind of manipulate the land around them, most of the time there's this conversation of ecosystem services, and it's always focused on the human benefit from those services. And I think many cities are starting to realize that the natural systems also offer more benefit than just a purely one-sided, or looking at what ecosystem services can be provided by one particular type of green space, or, for example, just canopy cover for trees, which are a lot of cities kind of focus on. So this more holistic approach to providing naturalized spaces is oftentimes starting to be kind of looked at in terms of how to kind of to not necessarily just look at the financial situation, but also look at the longer extent in terms of the complete system. So maybe that's just a citywide approach that's starting to become more and more popular, but there is that willingness to kind of look at it from a different perspective.
Okay, thank you, Donnie. So Alain Mignot has a question in the chat. Most of the climate simulations have ignored permafrost release of methane because of the uncertainty. This could explain why warming is almost always worse than predicted by climate models. Taking this variable into account, are we headed to a 7-degree warming in 2100? That's a very good question, Alain. Merci.
I can take this one. So yeah, it is true that a lot of climate models, especially in the last IPCC report, they didn't include the permafrost carbon feedback. And there is some uncertainty about how the permafrost carbon feedback works, especially from carbon dioxide and methane coming from the seabed permafrost or from lakes. But I would also say that it is generally understood enough that we know that how it's depicted in the media as a potential tipping point where there's no turning back, that's probably a bit extreme and a bit alarmist. So really a better way to look at it is for a particular temperature target, so let's say 1.5 degrees, we have good estimates of how much carbon dioxide and methane will be released from thawing permafrost at that amount of global warming. And so it can be, and we can use that to adjust our carbon budgets to have better policy so that we can actually achieve these temperature targets. And to put it into perspective, like how much emissions we're expecting from this kind of permafrost thaw. So for 1.5 degrees of warming, if we want to avoid 1.5 degrees but get close to it, it'll be roughly 90 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that's about a bit less than 3 years of what we currently emit on an annual basis. So we would want to account for that in reducing our carbon budget to achieve these targets.
And so I could add that, in general, climate simulations haven't ignored permafrost methane because of uncertainty. I mean, the reason why it's only now being added to climate models is because models are typically built in a hierarchy of what people think is the most important. And so the really big feedbacks in the climate system are the ones that we know and understand very well, like water vapor and ice albedo feedbacks and cloud feedbacks. And so some of these all of these things are uncertain, but they're all in models because you always start with the biggest and the most important processes when you're building a model. And so permafrost, it's certainly an important process, but it's less important than many of the other feedbacks that are already in the models, and so that's partly why it's coming out now as an important thing, because it's kind of the cutting edge of where models are and how they're being developed. But it is another feedback, and if it's it's probably a positive feedback, and so it will make climate changes larger than they would otherwise be. But it's not a feedback that kind of overwhelms the other ones that we already know about and that are pretty well accounted for in the models. Best estimates of I would also say that despite all of the feedbacks that are in the climate system, the single most important thing that will determine how much warming occurs over the next century is how much we emit in terms of greenhouse gases. That is never going to change. That will always be the primary driver of warming. And currently, the only reason we would head to 7 degrees of warming is if we drive it there by continuing to ignore this problem, continuing to emit greenhouse gases at a far greater rate than we currently are today. The best guess of the best projection of what warming would be consistent with the current trajectory of emissions is about 3 degrees by the end of 2100. And so we're certainly not at the moment on track to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, but we're also not on track for 7 degrees of warming. We are starting to curb the rate of emissions, and if even the kind of the limited level of ambition that's currently in place and reflected in climate policies, if that continues, then we're kind of on a 3-degree warming scenario right now.
Thanks, Damon. So we are at 12:30. So we had said that this thing would go for an hour, and it has. So if anyone needs to go ahead. But if anyone would like to stay and ask and answer more questions, please feel free. We will be here till 1 if anyone wants to stay for an extra half an hour. I also wanted to say that this has gone really well, and the lab is open to do this again. Maybe we could do the next one en français. So if you're interested in being on our mailing list for the next event, I'm going to put my email in the chat, and you can email me and I'll put you on a list. And but we're going to carry on with the questions and answers for another half an hour. Even the lab members, you don't have to stay if you have to go, it's okay. But Damon is going to stay, and anyone else can stay. So yeah, thank you to everyone who's been here. So we're going to go to another question that came up on the actual Facebook chat earlier, and it is this one. Considering recent history with countries freely pulling out of accords like Paris or Kyoto, can we realistically hold countries accountable for hitting emissions targets without political ultimatums? For example, canceling trade deals, tax hikes, etc., or force? Are forms of global governments a solution to this, or how can we ensure commitment with the systems we have in place now?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of a big question that it's, I don't know, I mean, maybe I can answer just by giving a bit of history in terms of how the climate negotiation process has evolved over the years. I mean, Kyoto Protocol in 1997 was constructed around the idea of the international climate negotiations assigning and dictating emissions targets to different countries, and that process by and large failed and did not result in any substantial decreases in national emissions, and so the idea of the Paris Agreement and the discussions leading up to that was to kind of put the onus on individual countries to offer their own emissions targets and present targets that were thought to be feasible at the national level and also consistent with the goals of the agreement. And so by and large that's what people did, and one of the kind of big steps forward for the Paris Agreement was that every country in the world did submit a target, and so we're trading off control and enforcement, because there is none under the Paris Agreement. There's no mechanisms that bind countries to achieve their targets, but we are we have created a kind of a unanimous agreement that targets are necessary, and that countries will unanimous, okay, at least until Trump came along and decided to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement. So I don't know whether this is there's reasons why, kind of voluntary targets and moral suasion and just kind of shifting discussions toward an understanding that action is necessary. There's reasons to think that might be a more effective way of encouraging countries to decrease their emissions. On the other hand, at some point it may get to the point that more I don't know, interventionist actions are necessary. I don't know. It's not an easy question to answer.
No, it's a good one though. It's an important question. I have another one from the Facebook. Since the production of renewable energy could also pollute and violate Indigenous rights in relation to their lands, for example, like Hydro-Quebec, is it really a sustainable solution to climate change? Can we think of other alternatives? And I think it's, no, let's just stick with that one. There's a question that follows it that is a little bit related, but let's just stick with that one. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I can take it if anyone else.
Why don't you go ahead, Jim?
Just that it is true that it's not like we could keep our societies and energy systems and everything and economies functioning exactly as is, but moving from fossil fuels to renewable energy. I don't think that is going to work, because renewable energies also have their impact and their needs for mining and rare earth and lithium and all these other things, including the impacts of hydro, are huge and have been borne in Quebec specifically by Indigenous people. But that's true with other things, for example, the lithium mining, which has been recently happening on Indigenous land in Bolivia. So I think the answer is not just to move to renewables, it's to reduce consumption, become way more efficient, become way less wasteful, become way more careful, and use the energy way more carefully, so that we have way less need for it. And then the needs we do have could be covered by renewables. But I think there's a lot of things, because some people say, well, I don't know, it's a complicated question, but I think we need to be thinking about solutions that work for everyone, where the solutions don't lead to new sacrifice zones, or the ongoing treatment of people in places as sacrifice zones for renewable energies. Anyone have anything to contribute?
I just kind of echo something I said before about trying to avoid trading off climate progress against other negative environmental impacts, and the same holds for social impacts of policies. I think there are ways of designing climate policy responses that don't further alienate marginalized peoples, that don't exacerbate social inequality, that don't so this is probably the hardest part of the climate challenge, is figuring out what are those pathways that represent a win for as many people as possible, and trying to prioritize those actions.
So another question that was in the Facebook discussion is climate activism better suited to influencing supply side or demand side mitigation? Is there a difference that should inform climate activism? So I think that's a really great question for the discussion between climate activists and climate scientists. So I'd love it if we could think about that one a bit.
This would be a good question for Daniel as well, but maybe I'll take a stab at it.
Thanks.
Rather than calling him back onto the call. So the question, demand side action, supply side action. So demand side action would be something like putting a carbon tax on gasoline, something that is meant to curb the demand for fossil fuel based products, whereas supply side policies would be something like the government putting a moratorium on new fossil fuel infrastructure, or limiting fossil fuel extraction in some way. And insofar as demand side policy seems to be more politically attractive right now. There seems to be very little political appetite for supply side policies and kind of government intervention in like the oil and gas industry or in extraction activities. So that suggests that there's maybe more of a role for activism to try to promote those policy solutions because they're not currently being explored very fully. And I think demand side certainly has a role, and it's not going to hurt to orient your activist energy towards anything that's going to take us in the right direction. And I think both demand side and supply side policies have a role, but it does seem like right now supply side policies are not being given the attention and the priority that they maybe should have, and so I think there's definitely a role for public pressure to try to raise those in the government priorities.
Yeah, I think there's often a lot of debates that go on in scholarly as well as academic circles about the most effective strategy, and I think or the most effective targets and this kind of thing. But I think we've seen with like divestment campaigns, we've seen pressure being put in many different ways, and I think it's when there's a convergence of pressures from different angles that you start to see things shift. So I would say both supply side and demand side are completely necessary, and maybe some interesting like collaborations across, where groups who are working on supply side and groups that are working on demand side collaborate with a kind of shared but differentiated strategy can be kind of effective. Okay, folks, who else has a question? We're gonna just wrap it up in a few minutes if I don't see more hands, more questions in the chat. Anyone?
It seems like people are starting to trickle out.
Yep.
Be a good time to end.
Sure.
I do want to thank everyone for participating in this today. It's been really, it's been fun.
Yeah, thank you so much for everyone for coming. And I think this exchange between the people on the ground doing the activism and the folks in the universities doing the science and research is super powerful. And I'd love to do it again. So keep in touch. Thanks so much. Oh, Sam, you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to ask if we'll continue making Facebook events, because I think that was that reached a lot of people on my end.
Yeah.
So top of your email list, we'll continue making Facebook events.
Of course, yeah. Yep, absolutely. Any last chance for questions? No? Okay, thank you so much. Oh yeah. Who is?
Hi guys. It's
Chen, yes. Okay, yeah, sure.
Right behind my head. I was wondering about the forest fire situation in California. There's been a lot of eruption in the news about this is climate change, but do we have proof that it's climate change, or is it sort of we're guessing at this point? I mean, I know for sure climate does impact forests, obviously, but there's also the question of poor urban planning, residential, why are we building houses close to forests? Are we doing controlled burns? Are we clearing brush to sort of, keep that large inferno from happening when lightning does strike? I don't know. I feel like it's the media is playing it up as it's all climate change, but I feel like there's a combination of things going on there. But I don't know. What do you think?
Go ahead, Mitch.
I was gonna say, like in California specifically, there's a big drive to be building or having new developments for housing because they have a bit of an overpopulation problem. So there's a lot of housing going into areas where that are prone to forest fires. There's obviously like forest management issues where we're trying to not let these natural forest fires happen. And we've been doing that for a long time. So there are factors that contribute to it that are from our forms of managing these fires that don't have to do with climate change. But I know that there has been a couple studies that link that show that forest fires in California specifically, and the increase that's been seen in California specifically is linked to climate change, and there's a strong correlation there.
Okay, so we do have evidence of that already.
Yeah, and I think there is evidence. I mean, it's always going to be a question with any kind of natural disaster or extreme event or hurricane. You know, to what extent is this a natural event versus a climate modified event? And I mean, I think, you know, to some extent, the answer to all of it is that there is a signal of climate change, because we know climate is changing, and, you know, by definition, a changing climate will change the conditions for wildfires, and that certainly has been the case in California, also in Australia. So I mean, so it's not to say the climate is the cause of everything, and certainly there are things that are more prone to change from climate than others. But yeah, there is evidence that wildfire is one that has the potential to increase very dramatically as temperatures warm and as precipitation patterns shift in ways that promote the more severe and more long-lasting fires.
But do you feel like the media is portraying this properly? Like, I feel like it's, I don't know, I feel like people need to be aware of the full scope of the situation. I feel like it's just, you know, climate change, which is good. Like, we need to know that, but I think we should also be presenting the full picture of, you know.
I mean, I think it depends a lot what media you listen to. If you listen to Fox News, you're going to hear exactly the opposite story. And one of the issues around fires in California right now is they're being, you know, politicized, and the Republicans are giving you one story and everyone else is trying to counter that with a different story. So yes, I mean, yeah, there is for sure a signal of forest management. Forest management has the potential to affect fire regimes. You know, in general, forest management has led to fewer fires over the last couple hundred years. You know, or over the last, you know, throughout most of the 20th century, forest management led to fewer fires, less area burnt because of fire suppression. So yeah, there is certainly a role, and it's impossible to say that any particular event is all because of climate change. But you know, I think in this case, the evidence is pretty good that climate change has made these fires worse than they otherwise would have been.
And I think one of the things that we could also point to is that former forest management, which seems to was very effective in suppressing forest fires before, are no longer effective anymore with these fires that are taking place because of the multiple ignition points, because of the dry forests, as well as the amount of material that's on the ground because of the drought. All of these things kind of point to climate impacts that are compounding the forest fire regime. So I don't think we can kind of just say that it's bad forest management. I don't think they've ever had to manage the forests in this type of way to prevent forest fires.
So question, oh, sorry, go ahead, Tanya.
I was just going to say, so sort of like COVID exasperating pre-existing health conditions.
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
I think in general, it's reasonable to think of climate change as a threat amplifier. You know, you know, things that are happening, and inevitably climate change is going to make them worse, and that's one of the ways that this is, you know, and is becoming a very serious problem.
A slightly related question came up from Gabrielle, which is, does anyone have any recommended sources for news that acknowledges the link between human activity and disasters? And also a question from WG, est-ce qu'il y a des articles scientifiques qui vous suggérez en français sur ces sujets? So two requests for resources.
Yeah. I mean, most of the scientific articles are written in English. Off the top of my head, I don't have a good suggestion for French resources, though, and maybe we can follow up after if we identify some.
Sure, we can. Yep, we can share them in the Facebook event if we come up with it. And what about for the news that acknowledges the link between human activity and disasters? I love Democracy Now! I watch Democracy Now! It's always good.
It does seem like most news does now acknowledge that link, and so that's I think a positive development. And I would say if you find a news outlet that is, not acknowledging the link between climate change and natural disasters, that's probably a good sign that it's one to avoid.
And there's some good suggestions coming through the chat for The Guardian, for Democracy Now!, etc. And Guy mentioned that related to the human activity and disaster, in the California case, one of the utilities was sued for mismanagement that led to the forest fires. So that's an interesting use of suing.
I think it was the campfire specifically,
Oh, I see.
P&G in California, which is one of the utilities. The campfire, which was one of the biggest last year or 2 years ago, whenever that was sued for that.
I think we'll in the conversation, maybe with Brenda's question that she put on Facebook, which was related to, and I'll paraphrase, I'll take the liberty to paraphrase since she's my mom. And elders are important in this fight. And so Brenda asked is, like, what would it take to actually, what would it take for all the factions to come together so that we can take concerted action and actually meaningfully reduce emissions and solve this climate crisis, which is the big question. Anyone have any thoughts on that? I think she's also asking sort of what are the chances that that's going to happen.
I mean, it's something I get asked a lot, and I don't have like a really good tangible answer to it. But it is. I think anything that you can think of doing that will help make that happen is going to be part of the solution. So that's one thing I would say. I would also say that things are starting to change in the world, and this is really in the absence of really concerted, ambitious political leadership. At a high political level, a good portion of the political leaders in the world either don't think it's a problem at all, don't think it's real, or don't think it's that big of a problem. And so there isn't the kind of international consensus on the we haven't had the political leadership that could really accelerate progress, and so kind of at that level, there hasn't actually been that much effort that's really been put into solving this problem, and most of the effort has come from the grassroots and from intermediate agencies and organizations that are doing lots of work and are starting to make progress. And so the optimistic conclusion of that, if you want to inject some hope into the end of this discussion, is that it wouldn't actually take a lot of real political leadership to kind of mobilize those efforts and accelerate them really quite dramatically. And as individuals, as activists, kind of trying to mobilize that political leadership, I think is probably one of the most important things that you can do. We can all decrease our own carbon footprint, but really trying to influence societal, more systemic societal change is really, really important. And I think it's it's one of those things that, to use a wildfire analogy, it doesn't take much to start a wildfire. And I think the same is true of societal transformations. I think given the right push, I think it could actually go really quickly.